It's about time. Yeah, we can. Well, it looks like my friends are all here. It's a hot summer day, and they're still winding down from July the 4th. That's okay. Yeah. I don't know whether it's worse to drive in the dark with the ice or to be out in the heat. I don't know. Probably driving in the dark on ice is probably worse. Is everybody okay? Now, we don't have class next week, but then I come back and we're back. And let's see, do I need to tell you anything? The parking lot is going to start getting paved soon, so it may be a mess. Moving towards not a mess, which is good. And I can't think of anything else to tell you, but I'm ready for this. Are you guys ready for this?
Yep, we're here.
All righty. I have an awful lot of notes, but I'll stop at an appropriate moment. How's that sound? So, okay, let me, where are we? We're in chapter 12, right? And we were in the middle of the paying taxes to Caesar, right? All righty. I have a mark in my notes where we're starting, and it's at verse 15b. I guess that's how you say it. Okay. All righty, let me pray for us, and we'll get going. Have you guys, are you ready for me? Okay, great. All righty. Let me pray for us, and then we'll get going. Lord, I am thankful for this opportunity to look into your word and to hear what you have to say to us through this. I'm so moved by all that we can see and what we have been given from you, and I pray, Lord, that what I say tonight will honor you and the work that you've done through your Son. Thank you again for these people and all of those who are watching online or who watch later. Pray, Lord, that this teaching will be a blessing to them. I thank you in Jesus' name. Amen. All righty, I'm going to read the whole thing since it's so short, but we'll start talking about it where Jesus responds. It says, later, the leaders sent some Pharisees and supporters of Herod to trap Jesus into saying something for which he could be arrested. Teacher, they said, we know how honest you are. You are impartial and don't play favorites. You teach the way of God truthfully. Now tell us, is it right to pay taxes to Caesar or not? Should we pay them or shouldn't we? And Jesus saw through their hypocrisy and said, why are you trying to trap me? Show me a Roman coin, and I'll tell you. And when they handed it to him, he asked, whose picture and title are stamped on it? Caesar's, they replied. Well then, Jesus said, give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, and give to God what belongs to God. And his reply completely amazed them. I think I talked about this last week, that there is some aspect to this that if you don't know all the contextual things related to it, that it won't make any sense, and we're going to get into a lot of it tonight. And I just have to say that this particular passage is just so loaded with context. Jesus, again, his response, he says, he's not fooled by them at all. And so we'll start right where it says, Jesus saw through their hypocrisy and said, and I just want to talk for a minute, or in the Greek it says, knowing their hypocrisy. There's something about, and can I just say something about the NLT? I'm the reason we use it. And like when I was reading it, I can't help but think about the differences between what the Greek says and what they have written down. I just want to say this, though, that I am more and more, I guess, okay with the fact that I moved us to this translation, because where they have shifted the language to not reflect the Greek perfectly, they've actually made it make a lot more sense. And so I just want you to know that I'm happy with this translation, even though I say all the time in this class, Well, they didn't really say that in the Greek. But in this case where it says he saw through their hypocrisy. Is that what it said? Yeah, he saw through their hypocrisy. The Greek actually says knowing their hypocrisy, and I think knowing is way different than seeing through it. There's this constant thing in Mark where Jesus, remember the big question was what? Who is this man? And now we're going to see it even more in the next section, but it's good to know that he knows more than just normal people know. But hypocrisy, great word. You do know that the word means an actor. It's not oh, look there, actors. Theater masks. Yeah. Wouldn't you like to have to wear that one over there? Well, they wore those. You know why they wore those? Because it was to show the emotion they were feeling, and they were huge masks that they wore so that people at the back could see what they were feeling, because they couldn't really hear them very well. And so they had to know what their feelings were. But an actor in their world, a hypocrite was not a bad thing in their world. What it meant was someone who pretends to be someone else. Now, we think of a hypocrite as a terrible thing. And and in the New Testament, it takes on a negative connotation. But when he says, he doesn't say they are hypocrites, he says seeing their hypocrisy. What he's meaning is seeing that they were pretending to be something that they weren't, and then he starts in. Now, we have to remember, what is it that they're pretending to be? They are pretending to be concerned about whether they pay the taxes to Caesar or not. The truth is that the Pharisees already had made up their mind. In fact, a lot of the Pharisees, I may have mentioned this, wouldn't even look at these coins, let alone touch them. They had made up their mind, no, we are going to do everything we can to avoid it. They may have to pay it out of obligation, but they hated it. And then the Herodians paid it with great fervor because they knew that the money was going to the very dude who they were keeping all their position and power through, Herod. And so there's the acting part is that they've come to him with a question. And it says seeing through their hypocrisy, or knowing their hypocrisy. Yeah, can you put the next passage up for me, Jeff? Yeah, it said Jesus knowing their hypocrisy. And then he says, why are you trying to trap me? Now, we've just had the word trap earlier. The first word is different than the second word. Okay, they shouldn't have said trap here. Trap for the first one is right. This one is it's perizate. Is that what it is? It is. Okay, it's different. It means to test someone, to try to fool them, or to see if they know what they know what they're talking about, kind of thing. The other one was like, remember I said it was like when you hook a fish. The other one was like when you catch an animal in a trap. That one is far more violent. This one is, why are you talking to me like this? He didn't say you hypocrites. He says he knows they're not serious, and says, well, why are you trying to test me in this manner? Like, to what end is this? Well, their end is to get him to what? Make either one group, the crowd, mad, or to make the Romans mad, because they want one of those two groups to do something to Jesus so they don't end up with blood on their hands. That's what this is all about. That's all it is. Can you put it back up there for me, Jeff, the text? Yeah, it says, then Jesus says, Now, actually, the next sentence here says, show me a Roman coin and I'll tell you. He does not say, and I'll tell you. This is the NLT translators making Jesus nicer than this is. This whole thing is I think in the notes I used the word brusque. Is that a word? Is brusque a word? It just came out of me when I was writing down the notes, but it's like Jesus is boom, boom, boom in this. He says, well, he actually says, show me a denarius. The denarius, and I'm sure I talked about this last week, but that was the cost of the tax, 1 denarius. The cost of a denarius was to each person the amount that a working person was paid. Do you remember the story that Jesus tells where he brings people into work and they work all day, but the guy goes out and he finds some people around lunchtime, and then he goes out and finds people about an hour before they quit. Well, he gives them all a denarius. And they're mad because that's what you get if you work for 1 day. That was standard. Now, you want to talk about controlled economies, that's what you got paid if you worked in that world. And everybody got paid a denarius for a day's work. And that's what the tax was. It was 1 denarius. And I think I told you last week that Dr. Cranfield, he's like my favorite Greek person, but he says, it's equal to 1 shilling. And I'm thinking, we used to live in England and they didn't have shillings then. Like, how long ago did they write this book? But anyway, so I don't even know what a shilling is. But it's not very much. It's a day. And the truth is that the working class in that time didn't make very much. They just didn't make very much. But anyway, now he says, show me a Roman coin. Well, this says a couple of things. He says, let me see it, is what he says. First off, it means that Jesus does not have one of these evil coins on his person. Okay, so Jesus is not carrying Roman money. So they can't blame him, no matter what comes down, for him carrying the money. By the way, Jesus is a Galilean. And last week I went way too crazy explaining people here and there and where they ruled and all that stuff, and I'm sorry that I wore you out with that. But the point is that the guy who was demanding the denarius did not control Galilee, and so Jesus never had to pay this anyway. So this puts Jesus at an even more bad position, because whatever decision he comes out with, one or the other, he doesn't have to worry about it anyway, because he's Galilean and they don't pay this tax. So Jesus doesn't have the money, but he also knows that somebody who's asking him the question does, right? Because he says, show me a denarius, and he's talking to Herodians and Pharisees. Now, probably there's not a chance that any of the Pharisees had Roman coins in they didn't have pockets. They had we would call them purses, but they carried little pouches, leather pouches, and they would have the money in there. But probably the Herodian might. Now, have I talked about the coin? It's silver. It's very small. It has a bust of Caesar's head on it. There we go. Boom. See this? And what it says in it's in abbreviated Latin. It says, let me get it exactly right. Oh, yeah. Tiberius Caesar, because he was the emperor, son of divine Augustus. Now, can I just say, when you say you are the son of the divine somebody, you are making a claim to what? God, deity, Godhead. You are a God. Now, we are not quite to the point in the Roman Empire where Caesar declared that he needed to be worshiped as a god. This doesn't happen until into the 60s of the Roman Empire. We're in the 30s. But in the 60s, just so you know this, the worship of the Caesar as a god did not start because the Caesars thought of themselves as anything special. It started because various locations around the empire, particularly in Turkey, could not, can I go into this? Do you want to hear this? I think this is kind of cool. They could not raise enough food in the areas where they lived to feed their populations. And so the Caesars were shipping grain from Egypt up to Turkey and bringing enough food from the breadbasket of the world, which was Egypt, to keep them all eating. And so they started to have in Turkey, at places like Ephesus and Thessalonica and all the places that we know about from the early church, those towns began to have festivals to Caesar. And they would claim him to be a demigod, claim him to be the one who controls the world. They would use the term Lord to refer to him, just to make sure that he stayed loving them. Because all it would have taken was one word from Caesar and he'd stop shipping them grain. So, you see what I'm saying? So the early church big problem was that if you didn't participate in the local celebrations to honor Caesar as a god, you were being a bad citizen. That's the problem in the early church. Being bad citizens, not participating with everybody in the worship of Caesar. Well, by the time you get to the late 60s, the Caesars have gotten so used to being called gods that gone to their heads. But this is a sign, this is a sign that at least Tiberius thought of his dad as being a god, and so son like father, and so that's offensive to the Jews because there's only one God, and Caesar's not God. Plus, that's a graven image. That's an idol. And you guess what it says on this side? It says Pontifex Maximus. It means high priest. Now, I do not know that the denarius could have been any more offensive to the Jews. It's got an idol on one side. It's got a guy claiming to be God who's got his picture on there. And when you flip it over, it says high priest. Now, that's why they didn't want anything to do with it. And they certainly didn't want to have to pay that money in that form to the government so they could, and primarily used the money, do you know that? Did I say this last week? They primarily used the money to fund the Roman garrison in Jerusalem. So anyway, that's where we go. Now, Jesus says something that, he says, show me the coin. It doesn't say that he took it in his hand and he flipped it over or anything. It says he just looks at it. And then it says, when they handed it to him, he says, whose picture and title are stamped on it? Now, this is important. In the Roman Empire, no one owned money. It was owned by the person whose picture and name was stamped on it. Okay? Caesar owned all the money. If his picture was on it and his name was on it, it belonged to him. When you paid it you were not paying him out of your money. You were giving him back some of the money that he let you use. And this was an economic reality throughout the entire empire. That's just the way it was. Nobody thought of their money as their own. They were getting to use it, borrow it. It was, in fact, it's him saying whose picture and title are stamped on it was like a well, duh statement. No, seriously. It's like everybody knew that they didn't own the money. It was Caesar's. And that when he says this, what he's saying is, okay, whose money is this really? And they say of Caesar. Yeah, it's like they knew that he knew was, but they're making him admit, because when they say Caesar's, his face, his picture of him and his name is on there, what they're actually saying is that it belongs to him. Those things are marks, they're stamps of ownership when it comes to money. Now, they did allow other parts of the government to mint their own coins. And those kinds of coins circulated in different ways. Like do you remember me talking about them in the temple using the Tyre from Tyre? They used a separate coin that didn't have anything on it. And they were allowed to use that money, but it was not considered the money that really mattered. Caesar himself would have not taken in taxes any money that other people had minted. We used to dig these up when we worked as a Roman archaeologists in Britain. You'd dig up coins, and they're dated. They were dated in their own way, and you knew who was emperor when, and so you knew if you found something there that it couldn't have gotten there before a certain year because that's when he was there, and it's best. By the way, saying that all the money belongs to Caesar in England, when you find all that stuff, guess who it belongs to? The Queen. So, yeah, anything of value belongs to the Queen. So, yeah, if she wants it, she can have it. She doesn't seem to want much of it right now, but if she wanted it, she could have it. But anyway, it says, they say Caesar. But what we've really gotten into now is ownership. Who owns what? Who's in charge of what? We're not into, Jesus is not going to let them take him into some sort of philosophical discussion about whether we should do this from a religious or political position. He's just simply saying, he's going to say, well, we can put the next passage up. He says, well then, he goes, it's very terse. Maybe that's a better word than brusque. But he says, give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar. Well, now that we know that it actually does belong to Caesar, that makes a whole big different thing. It's a whole completely different idea that you're not giving him something that he's forcing you to give out of what's yours. You're just giving him back something that belongs to him. And he wants it back. And the other thing is, give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar. And when you give it back to him, it's a statement in some way to say, okay, I'm giving this back to you because of all that you bring to me. All right? Now, we have to be honest. Have you ever seen that? I mean, if you've watched the movie, I've never gotten through the whole thing, but have you ever watched The Life of Brian? The movie by Monty Python, The Life of Brian, where the Jewish radicals are all gathered, and the guy stands up and he goes, what have the Romans ever done for us? And they sit there, well, and one guy goes, well, they built the roads. And he goes, okay, they built the roads. And the guy goes, but other than the roads, what have the Romans ever done for us? And another guy goes, well, they built a sanitary system. And he goes, okay, roads, sanitary system. And they brought peace to Judea. He goes, okay. Besides, and pretty soon he's like listing like 50 things. And the last scene is him going, besides the roads and the this and the this and the this and the this. And it's just this huge list. And he goes, what have they done for us? And there's silence. And he goes, let's kill them. It's like that. But the truth is, it's true. Yeah. And the garrison, to pay for the garrison, 1 denarius, of Caesar wanting 1 denarius back to pay for the garrison, actually brought peace to Israel. Because the reason it was there was because they were killing each other. And they were out of control. And in fact, that's why Pilate was there. That's why to keep them from killing each other, because they were so divided in their world. Civil war was far more of a danger in Judea than war against the Romans. So anyway, he says, well, give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar. Well, that's good. Okay, we get that. But then he's not done. He says, and give to God what belongs to God. And that makes us step back. What belongs to God? Everything belongs to God. Even Caesar is a part of what belongs to God. His statement forces them to think quite broadly about everything. And what he is not saying, which is what we tend to do in this world when we see this, as if there are two completely separate systems. One is a political system which we are forced to pay our taxes to, and then one is a God system where we decide how much we're going to give to God. And he's not saying that at all. He's saying God sits over all of this. And what this is reminding them of is Jeremiah, where Jeremiah says of the Babylonians, God is over them and he's using them, and so settle down in Babylon and raise families and make money and pay taxes and be a good citizen. Go back, and I've got them in all these things. And he's saying something that reminds them of the fact that maybe God himself is using Caesar to do something within our world, and we need to render to God what is his, which is an allegiance to his will. Now, the other thing is this. Caesar demanded very little, and the Jewish leadership and people broadly raised a huge stink over what he demanded. And what Caesar gave them was great, but it was small in comparison to what God has given us. God has given us his world. He has given us all. I mean, when we can't stop thinking of the things that God has given to us. And yet, they were raising a huge fuss over having to give this to Caesar, and at the same time they were enacting strict laws which made it possible for them to never give anything to God. And what he's trying to get them to do is to think outside of that box that you're worried about this, when the truth is that God, who demands very little of you, has given you way more than what you think, than what you're getting from. Does this make sense? He's like opening it way up. And then it says that he completely amazed them. That word is, it's a word that means that they were stunned by his brilliance. Sometimes it's hard for us to see the brilliance in it, but the truth is that he was just being very practical about things. He was saying, I'm not going to get into the fuss between whether we should pay Caesar or not pay Caesar. I'm not going to make one half of you mad or the other half of you mad. I'm not going to get involved in that. What he did was he actually endeared everybody to him. He did exactly, their question brought him to a place where the people who said, we should pay to Caesar the denarius. Well, he said we should pay to Caesar the denarius. And the people who said, we should never have to pay that denarius to Caesar because we are faithful to God. Well, he said, be faithful to God in one sentence, and he made them all happy. Everybody is happy. Now, there's also one other aspect to this that's really pretty cool. And I don't believe for a minute that they caught it at the moment that he said it. But remember when I said that the stamp of an image of a Caesar on the coin showed ownership. that coin is owned by and can be controlled by, and Caesar has the right to make demands of that money because it belongs to him. Now, think with me for a moment about how we are described as created beings. We have been stamped with the image of God. Now, I think this is way cool. We have been created with something that in essence says we have an owner who has the right to make demands upon us because he owns us from our creation. We are made in the image of God, and he has a right, just as Caesar had a right to make the rules for what you do with the money he owns. He has a right to make the rules for what we do with our lives because he owns us. Now, I think that's powerful. I do not believe for a moment that anyone caught it, but it's absolutely there. It's absolutely there because the language is the same. That we are stamped with the image of God. Does this make sense? It makes us step back about when he says, and render unto God what is God's. What is God's? I am. And these questioners, the Herodians and the Pharisees, they were not thinking of themselves as being the property of or being owned by. They were more interested in other things. In fact, they were far more interested in proving their own righteousness to God to make him act on their behalf, as opposed to thinking, their thinking in the Pharisees was that if they could get everybody to live according to the law, God would be obligated to send the Messiah. So that's what they're thinking. They're obligating God to them. And Jesus is saying, you're fussing about one coin. You should be thinking about the fact that you are obligated to God simply because you're here. So, is that good? Does that make sense? That makes sense? That's the end of that hunk, so we probably ought to take a break here before I go on to the next one, but I think that's all really interesting. A lot of people make a lot of noise about this being Jesus making what they do is they either say that the secular world we need to pay those taxes because there's a secular world out there, and we also need to pay attention to God, and these are two things that don't exist together. Then there are people who say that what we need to do is we need to put the religious world or the world of the sacred on top of the secular world, and it should function under the rules of the sacred world. That's what's happening in Afghanistan right now. And then there are people, primarily in the Western world, who say that we should not pay attention to this world, that we should lay the secular world on top of the world of faith and live by am I making sense? These are the way it falls out. But this passage is not talking about how any of those things work. This passage is saying that God is big enough that he can use this world, the secular world, to reach his purposes. And so when you render to Caesar what actually belongs to him, you're just participating in some way of God working in the world. That's what he's saying. So let's take a break, and we'll come back and we'll hit the next section. You turned me off. I was waiting for like 3 weeks to tell you that we had been stamped in the image. I mean, I've been excited about saying that because I read a number of scholars who talked about it, and you'll see that they argue about that, primarily because they don't believe that anybody would have understood it at the time. But it doesn't matter. There's tons of stuff that we figured out much later. We figured it out much later. But anyway, that's cool. Okay, we'll come back in a minute. Even though if it doesn't have anything to do with the class, we can. By the way, not this week. Dave Rod preaches this week, and he said I set him up really well. Yeah, he was nice about it, but it's like, how did that sermon set him up? I don't know. What's he? But then he's talking about Joseph. So then the next week, just so you know, is the week we celebrate 10 years of the Care Center. And we're having one service at 10:30. And I'm preaching, and I think I told you, they told me I could only preach for 10 minutes. Yeah. So I'm probably just going to get up and say, how's everybody doing? Yeah. Isn't it great, this Care Center thing? And I'll say, amen. Let's pray. It'll take me 10 minutes just to do that. So yeah, are we ready for this? The next section is verse 18. Now I just want to say this right before we get into this. What's interesting is that we've now seen Herodians, Pharisees, chief priests, elders, and scribes. And so I said this in the wrong place the last time, but there are only two groups left. The Sadducees and the Zealots. And they're the only two groups left that, in the major groups that we know about, who were religiously connected in some manner, who might have a interest in what Jesus is up to. Everybody else is part of the crowd. And so I'm not surprised at all that the next section we get the Sadducees. And I'll talk about that about them in a minute. But just so you know, the Zealots would have never had any interest in doing anything to Jesus. They were just mostly interested in keeping themselves away from the Romans, separating themselves. They were radicals. They were interested in violence. They did a lot of sneaking up behind Roman soldiers and stabbing them in the back kind of stuff. They're the last group. They were the ones who had the place at Masada, who were the last ones to go down. And so we're not going to run into them. We're not going to run into them. Because again, that Jesus is not a part of their deal. If Jesus is successful, they're fine with it. But if he's not, they're fine with it. They're that kind. But the Sadducees, interestingly, I think that they're now going to show up, and I'll talk about their showing up in a second, but they're going to show up and they're going to fuss with Jesus about life after death, of all things. That's what their thing is about, life after death. And, well, I'll explain why they talk about it, but, you know, if I was going to try to make somebody look really stupid, I don't know that whether there's life after death or not would be the way I go after it, because who among us can prove that there is life after death? So, you know, or there is or isn't. We all assume, and I think this next passage is actually very hopeful by what Jesus says. But let's read it and then we'll go on. And what time is it? Okay, it's 10 till, well, we're not going to be able to finish this section. I think I have 18 pages of notes on this next section. Yeah, so. All righty, here we go. Then Jesus was approached by some Sadducees, religious leaders who say there is no resurrection from the dead. They posed this question: Teacher, Moses gave us a law that if a man dies, leaving a wife without children, his brother should marry the widow and have a child who will carry on the brother's name. Can I just say how that would not work in our world? Can I just put it out there? But anyway, we'll talk about it later. Well, suppose there were 7 brothers, and the oldest one married and then died without children. So the second brother married the widow, but he also died without children. Then the third brother married her. This continued with all 7 of them, and still there were no children. Last of all, the woman also died. So tell us, whose wife will she be in the resurrection? For all 7 were married to her. Jesus replied, your mistake is that you don't know the Scriptures, and you don't know the power of God. For when the dead rise, they will neither marry nor be given in marriage. In this respect, they will be like the angels in heaven. But now, as to whether the dead will be raised, haven't you ever read about this in the writings of Moses, in the story of the burning bush? Long after Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob had died, God said to Moses, I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. So he is the God of the living, not the dead. You have made a serious error. All right, we're almost at the end of a section where Jesus is being questioned by various people. He's going to get one more question after this one, but the next question is not somebody trying to fool him. But this is a section where we get everybody after him. And now the Sadducees are not yet hating Jesus to the level where they want to kill him. Their question is primarily geared to make him look stupid. And I have to be honest, that it seems that, here's what I picture, okay? So that chief priests and the elders and the scribes had gotten put in their place by Jesus. And remember, they're all in the temple courts. It's Passover, and there are tons of people. And remember, in that world, no one is alone ever. There's always a crowd. And there's nothing to distract them, and so they're all listening to everything. And the first group has been offended, so they go and they talk to the Herodians and the Pharisees and say, hey, listen, can you go try to do something to get people to hate this guy? Because we want to get rid of him. Well, they come back to everybody, and they're standing around talking about it. And some of the Sadducees, because I'll tell you about the Sadducees in a minute, they go, you guys, you are trying to get Jesus killed by making half of the world hate him or the other half of the world hate him. You don't want blood on your hands. But this guy is a stupid Galilean preacher. He doesn't know anything. And we're going to just leave him to us. And we'll make him leave with his tail between his legs looking stupid. And everybody there will go, boy, those Sadducees made Jesus look like a fool. And he'll slink off back to Galilee, and he'll go with a reputation of somebody who just doesn't know anything. And they'll say, well, he has power to heal or something, and everybody will go, well, he's so stupid he must have it from what? The dark side. We can take care of him this way. I'm sure that's what they were thinking. It says, literally it says, and they come to Jesus, Sadducees. Okay, let's talk about the Sadducees for a minute. They are a group of people, men, who formed their, whatever you want to call, organization sometime in the 2nd century before Christ. We think their name was taken from the man Zadok, who was a priest, who's mentioned many times. Oh, great, there. Zadok, son of Ahitub. That's a great name, isn't it? And Ahimelech, son of Abiathar, were priests. Zadok and all the Levites also came along carrying the Ark of the Covenant of God. But Zadok the priest, Benaiah, son of Jehoiada, Nathan the prophet, Shammai, Ray, and David's personal bodyguard refused to support Adonijah. Okay? So he's a guy that was known for being a great priest. He got to carry the ark. And they think that Sadducee comes from his name, Zadok. That's the only thing they can figure. And Zadok is an anglicized form of the Hebrew, and so it seems like it would work. But anyway, they started about 2 centuries before Jesus. You had to be one of 7 families, the 7 richest, most powerful families in the country, to be a Sadducee. They were the people in charge of the temple. All of the things that went on in the temple were ruled by the Sadducees. They were the bosses of the boss. And so, now remember, you had to be a member of one of 7 families, and they were wealthy. And the fact that they were wealthy and that they were in charge of the temple proved that whatever it was they were doing was good with God, because that's the way that you knew whether somebody was in the right place, because they were, right with God, because they were in high positions with lots of money. Now, this may sound weird, but they were the conservatives of the Jewish world, like the fundamentalists of the Jewish world. They did not believe in any of the texts post the 5 books of Moses. All right? They didn't care about Psalms. Oh, they sang the songs, but it was a songbook to them. It was not scripture. They didn't pay attention to the prophets. They didn't pay attention to the historical books. All those books were fine if you wanted to read them, but they were not text from God. The only books that mattered were the 5 books of Moses. And since there is no mention of rising from the dead in the 5 books of Moses, they didn't believe in it. They believed that the way that you lived on was in your reputation. And the way that you got a good reputation was that you got powerful and rich, and everybody knew that you were a good person. And then your family could carry on your great reputation into the future, but there was no such thing as resurrection of the dead. Now, they also did not believe in angels or spirits of any other kind. Now, how they missed angels now I know how they missed it. They translated the Hebrew, and they looked at the way that the Septuagint worked. You know how everybody's always showing up with, they wrestle with a man, or a man comes, or they got a message from a man. And they never went to the next level to say they were literally messengers from God who might be angels. Angels do not show up really until you get into the later prophets. There's one story where they look and they see the fortress, they see the army of the angels there to protect, is it Elijah? Well, the Sadducees didn't believe any of that stuff. They thought they were making it up to make the story greater. But they did believe the first 5 books very carefully. And that's why it says, he was approached by Sadducees, and then we get an editorial comment by the author. It says, religious leaders who say there is no resurrection from the dead. A couple of things. The reason that Mark adds that is his audience is primarily Roman, Gentile. They don't know Sadducees from anything. They have no reason to know the Sadducees. And the vast majority of the people who would be reading this story, this part, would probably be reading it post 70 AD, and the Sadducees were completely wiped out when the temple was destroyed. In fact, the Pharisees and the Sadducees hated one another by then, and the Pharisees had declared that Sadducees were heretics, and we're unsure who actually killed off the Sadducees when Jerusalem fell. Does this make sense? Josephus talks about them a great deal. The only historical record we have of the Sadducees is in Josephus and the Gospels. And this is the only place in Mark where Sadducee word is used. They're mentioned in other places, but they never wrote anything purposefully, because what they didn't want to have happen was people to think what they wrote later was text. You get what I'm saying? Because they didn't write down what they believed. Everything we know about Sadducees comes from people who thought they were awful. All right? So I'm just saying, we got to be careful about them, because Josephus thought he speaks very unfavorably of them. And how many of you have ever finished up your Bible study and gone, boy, I wish I'd have been a Sadducee? Now, I know the joke is there. They didn't believe in the resurrection from the dead. That's why they were sad, you see. You know. Anyway. You hadn't heard that? That's like the biggest. The only other big one is that there's a motorcycle in the Old Testament where Joshua's triumph was heard throughout the land. Okay. Anyway, on we go. What was I saying? Resurrection. Anastasio, I think that's exactly the right way to pronounce the word. It is a Greek word that means a bodily resurrection from the dead. It does not mean an unbodied soul, which we think about, a lot of people think about, we die and then we become these souls that are out there with no bodies. And we think about that we're like, but that's not what they're talking about. This is a Greek concept. The Greek concept is, and it's not bad that it's a Greek concept, because this is what primarily the Jews believed. And here's what they believed, that there was a time coming when the Messiah came and God's kingdom came into the world, and you've probably heard me say this 50 times, that every Jew who was not reprobate would be raised from the dead in a body. And they believed that when you were raised from the dead initially, if you'd had your arm chopped off, you'd be raised without your arm. And if you got your eye poked out in a battle, you'd be raised without your eye and all that. And then God was going to heal everybody, because he was going to do what? He was going to bring healing to the nation. This is what they were thinking. And they saw this as... Now, and they had all kinds of crazy notions about it. Like they thought that people lived way far away would actually roll underground all the way to Jerusalem and rise from the dead. This is why at Pentecost there were people from all over the world who spoke all those languages. You remember that? Why are they there? It's because they moved at an older age to be back in Jerusalem, because when they died, they wanted to be in Jerusalem. So when God came back, they didn't have to roll all the way back from Gaul. They would rise up. This is why there are so many widows in the early church, because husbands and wives would move back to Jerusalem because they wanted to be there when they wanted to die there, so they'd be there when the resurrection happened. And their husbands all died too earlier because they'd all worked themselves to death before, and they would die. And so the world was filled with widows, Jewish widows, who spoke what? The big fuss was over what? Why do we have deacons? Because they spoke Greek. The Greek-speaking widows who had come from the areas where they spoke Greek back to Jerusalem. And all of this is because the vast majority of the people agreed with the Pharisees, who believed this, that there was going to be a bodily resurrection of everyone who had ever died who was Jewish, and the few Gentiles who had converted. And that would be those would be the people who ruled the world into eternity under the guide of the Messiah, and under the watchful eye of God, who would rule from the temple in Jerusalem. Now, this is what everybody believed except the Sadducees, who were in charge of the temple, and they looked down their noses at everybody because they knew more than anybody else does. Is this making sense? That was probably way too much information. But Mark has to tell the readers of Peter's gospel, this is what they believed, because they're going to ask a question about the resurrection, and they don't even care about the resurrection. They don't believe in the resurrection. They are going to go to a place that doesn't mean anything to them. Only idiots believe in a resurrection. That's their position. And so Mark has to say they don't believe in it. So we know what? That they are being hypocrites. They're acting like they care about something that they do not care about. Does that make sense? Okay, we don't have much more time. We have like 5 minutes. I'll just read. They pose the question. They go, "Teacher, of course, we had this before. Do you think that there was a single Sadducee in Judea who thought of Jesus as a teacher?" I don't think so. Let's put it this way. If you're like the director of a Broadway musical theater in New York City, and somebody from Keokuk, Iowa shows up and says, "I've been doing civic theater back home. I'd love to have a tryout." Get what I'm saying? The Sadducees were that way religiously about Galileans. He said, "What? Son of a carpenter? Who'd he study under? And why hasn't he been down here? And how cute." And they say, "Teacher." I'm just saying. Anyway. And this is Moses. Of course, Moses is the one person they believe. Okay? So they start out with Moses gave us a law. And then they talk about what's called Levirate marriage law. And they're absolutely nailing it on the rules. Now, if you go back to Deuteronomy and look at it, it doesn't, oh, great, good. If two brothers are living together on the same property, now that's where we have to start, okay? And one of them dies without a son, his widow may not be married to anyone from outside of the family. Instead, her husband's brother should marry her and have intercourse with her. I couldn't say that at church this last week, by the way. To fulfill the duties of a brother-in-law. The first son she bears to him will be considered the son of the dead brother, so his name will not be forgotten in Israel. The thing about his name is are we going to get the rest of it? But if the man refuses to marry his brother's widow, she must go to the town gate and say to the elders assembled there, "My husband's brother refuses to preserve his brother's name in Israel. He refuses to fulfill the duties of a brother-in-law by marrying me." The elders of the town will then summon him and talk with him. If he still refuses and says, "I don't want to marry her," the widow must walk over to him in the presence of the elders, pull his sandal from his foot, and spit in his face. Then she must declare, "This is what happens to a man who refuses to provide his brother with children." Ever afterward in Israel, his family will be referred to as the family of the man whose sandal was pulled off. End of rule. Now, we're not in here to talk about this very much, but I'll just say this. The reason is not so his name will be remembered. Here's the deal. Only the sons can inherit the father's property. Now remember, there are two brothers living on the same property. If the father is still alive and he dies and one of the brothers there's no children on that side, everything goes to the other brother. And that means that the wife is stuck. She has no security whatsoever. She needs a son so that when the father dies, that the land will be divided into two parts, and she will be taken care of by her son who has inherited his father's half. Now, the thing about the name is true. But that's what they're really talking about, because your name is associated with the place where you are. And so what this is about is it's protecting the widow from being left destitute because her husband dies. Now, there are only two examples of Levirate marriage law. Oh, by the way, Levirate in Hebrew means brother-in-law. Okay? Brother-in-law. So it means the brother-in-law. And did you notice in this story, the wife is all about it. She's all about it. Why? Because she is being faithful to her husband, and she also knows that if this guy doesn't do this, she's in a heap of trouble. Because this family does not have any obligation to her anymore. So she needs a child, a son who is in the family. Now, this is a completely different world than our world. I mean, obviously. I'm sure there are sects and cults out there who practice this, but they're out of their minds. And I'll just say this, that the only 2 times it's talked about in the Old Testament is Onan. If you remember him, because you know the story with him, that his dead brother's wife, he took her, but he took her and took her and took her, and the words are he spilled his seed on the ground, which means he never let her get pregnant. That was a bad one. God killed him. I cannot tell you how when I was a kid in high school, Onan was brought up frequently about the things that should not be done. I was scared to death of all sorts of sexual things because of Onan. And they called it, you don't want to be an Onanist. I never forget Jim Comer saying to us, I said that because my dad knows Jim. You don't want to be an Onanist. And I can tell you, they put a lot of stuff in that bucket. I'm just telling you. And the other one is Ruth. And Ruth, both times that it comes up in the Bible, it's not good. Or that somebody says, no, I don't want to do that. I don't want to risk my property. That's exactly what it is. So we have no idea if anybody ever practiced this. We certainly know that the purpose of it was to protect the woman in the moment. And we also know, now I'm just going to tell you this and then we'll be done. In the book of Tobit, chapter 3, I've read it. Don't waste your time. It's a story about a woman named Sarah who is married 7 times, not to brothers, but they all die because they're killed by an evil person. Now, the story ends happily, but the thinking is that the Sadducees probably borrowed the 7 brothers from the story of Sarah in Tobit, because Tobit is much older. It's intertestamental, but it was already considered, it was being considered as text by the Jews during the time of Jesus. So when they start down this road with the 7 brothers who all marry the same woman, they all die before she has a child, this is enough like something that everybody knows about, that it's ridiculous in the story of Tobit, but they're not brothers. They just take it to a far more ridiculous place because they're pulling the Levirate law thing in, because they want to talk about Moses. All right? Now, is everybody okay? Because we're going to stop here and it's going to be 2 weeks. Now, the people that weren't here, they're going to just be dead lost when they get... So just take my word for it. I'm going to have to recover a little bit of ground, a little bit. But we'll start with, they posed the question. Okay, and I won't go into all the stuff about Levirate law. But the truth is, they don't care about Levirate law. They're not asking Jesus about Levirate law. They want Jesus to make a statement about the resurrection from the dead so that they can prove to him through their absolute better understanding of the scriptures that he doesn't know what he's talking about. And he's going to get them. Okay? He's going to get them, and he's going to get, and I love this because this is Tim Ayers' area and I'm a little worked up. He's going to get them on the tense of a verb. One verb. One little word, ego. I am. And it's half of the name that God gave himself when he was asked, what is your name? And he said, my name is Ego Eimi. I am who I am. I am. And it says later, he says, I am the God of Abraham. That's what it all wants. And so that's why when we read, and I'll have to say this next time, Why? He says, you don't read the scriptures right. Why? Because you missed the tense of one verb, and it changes the world. Okay? Great. Okay, I'll see you in 2 weeks.